Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the symposium. I need to start just with a little bit of housekeeping, and you're probably all aware, but there are toilets down the hall, down near the lifts, and in the event of a fire, someone will come and grab you, if you haven't already gone, and tell you exactly where to go. So, and I feel like adding that obligatory thing that have a look around you, your best exit may be behind you, and do that sort of casual air hostess thing. But can I say welcome, and can I just start by saying too, isn't this fantastic that we've got an event like this? I know this is only about the second event. Has anyone here been to some of the earlier sessions as yet? Excellent. You've got the whole day planned out? It is going to be a great day. I just feel like we're so privileged to have an event like this happening in Toowoomba. If you look at the calibre of the speakers, it really is very, very impressive. Well, this morning's session is called First Course, Any Course, a Collision Course. How does food affect our mental health? And I'll start by just some introductions firstly, introduce our panel. But myself, my name's David Iliff. I present the breakfast program on ABC Southern Queensland. I did a mad dash over from the studios over to here just a moment ago, and the policeman had forgiven me. And the subject of food, I must admit, I put my hand up to do this session because the subject of food is something that's very close to my heart. My wife Karen and I have two boys who are on the spectrum, and so we've looked into food and the influence of that on their behaviour. We've had a lot of interest for many, many years on the effect of what goes into their mouth on what comes out of their mouth, if you like, and have found that it is very much a tangible thing. And for a long time we've done a lot of reading on that issue, and my wife could reel off a list of, the black list of food additives and things that she would rather our kids weren't even in the same room as, rather than, or even not eat. They're just, and we're talking about a lot more than that today, but it's a very, very broad topic. On the panel, let's introduce firstly Emma Ellis-Flint, author and nutritionist, and Sharon Donaldson. Sharon started the Source Kitchen here in Toowoomba, but has many other strings to her bow as well. But I'll start off by just getting both of you to just give us a little bit of background as to what you have to offer us today and how you've ended up in this field. Emma, can we start with you?
Yeah. Good morning, Toowoomba.
Good morning.
Hey. It's fantastic to be here, and I agree with David. What an event. This is beyond any expectations I had. It's amazing. Anyway, what brings me to be sitting here on this seat today? I was a chef for 20 years, and then I went back to study nutrition, a degree in nutrition, and then began working as a clinical nutritionist. But because of my background, I realised I wanted food to come to life for my clients, and so I began doing food workshops and then nutrition retreats. Then I wrote some cookbooks to once again try and facilitate that learning of great food and nutrition and healing. And because of that, I'm sitting here on this panel with that kind of knowledge base.
And Sharon?
So probably a fairly broad background, like Source is a passion, and I suppose for a lot of people food is a passion, and we share food in times that are joyous and in times that are sad. And the vision of Source was not to do a MasterChef course. It was more to get people back in the kitchen, and the children's classes have walked out in the garden and they see that beetroot comes out of the garden, not out of a tin. General practice, I suppose the link with mental health is that probably a third of the patients I see, there's an element of mental health issues there. And so constantly sitting there talking diet, food, exercise. And then my third link has been with Blush. And so we're doing, and a part of some pilot studies out of USQ, looking at the impact of psychosocial, food, exercise, on breast cancer and in fact on depression and mental health that relates to that breast cancer.
Well, we'll start the discussion, and towards the end we will give you a chance to ask any questions you might have, because I guess there's people here who are at various ends of the exploring this link between food and mental health, so we'll be able to take questions towards the end of the session. But I guess we'll start by, we've always known that there's been a link between food and our mood, and perhaps we've always assumed that connection was a positive one. That's why we've termed food, phrases like comfort food and soul food, and the positive connotations of food and what it can create within us. That's why in so many romantic comedies You usually find when the girl's been dumped and she gets together with her friends and they don't go out and go to a nightclub, they'll go home somewhere and have a big tub of ice cream, that comfort food. But trust us when we tell you, science has proven that there is very much a link between the way we feel, the way we act, our mental health, our feeling of well-being, and the food that we eat. And it's a lot more profound, perhaps, than Hollywood would have us believe. But Sharon, can I start with you? This is an area that is actually moving ahead quite quickly. We progressed a long way from just establishing a link between some conditions that might be caused by overeating, diabetes and potentially heart disease, and then the link between those and depression. We've gone actually way beyond that and found that there is scientific evidence for what we're talking about. Tell me a little bit more about that.
I still think it's fairly early days because everything has been anecdotal and retrospective studies where people have, had depression, and so then they fill out what their food and diet has been. And we find that some of those people don't actually probably report, like people's reporting of what they eat and what they actually eat are two very different things. And going through, we're doing a Fit Lab thing at the moment, and we talk to the women about their diet, and we know that what they're saying they're eating is not what they're eating. But there are now studies that are actually being set up where they're doing controlled studies with a dietary intervention and outcomes on mental health in comparison to actually a psychotherapy and what that does to depression. And they're going back and looking at things, like the basics I do is sort of the Mediterranean diet. And so that is really now coming into its own field of being looked at, studied with a direct outcome to mental health. So the issue becomes that, cardiovascular disease, mental health disease, they all have that interlinking obesity factor. So it's hard to isolate what is cause and effect, but I think the study's really
Absolutely.
about to take off about that.
I couldn't agree more. And it's quite fascinating. We're lucky in Australia. We have Deakin University that has a food and mood centre that's being funded quite well at the moment. And they're doing, this is exactly what they're trying to do, is set up studies that do finally prove that food does affect your mental health, because it has been retrospective studies, as Sharon said, in the past, and now they're actually going to look at it categorically and show. And in fact, they've already published one paper that showed the exact that improving your food improves your mental health. It's fantastic.
I must admit, when my wife and I first started going down this path and exploring that link, there was a lot of references to the influence of, or the connection between your gut health and triggering various responses in your brain. And it was interesting because there's a lot of speculation amongst people in the autism community and our two kids on the spectrum that gut health can actually be the cause of autism, which is not something that I necessarily buy into. But what stemmed from that was the link very much between gut health and the way your brain works, and some of the permutation. If your gut wall is not healthy enough, then that will influence your thinking. Tell me a little bit about that. It sounds very complex, but I'm sure you can simplify it for us.
I'll try and simplify it, but like Sharon was saying, with a lot of the studies, it's still emerging. This is very much emerging areas, and you can't categorically say one or the other, but what seems to be happening is what goes on in your gut influences quite strongly what goes on in your mind, in your head. And they found direct nerve links from your gut up to your head. But what's interesting, they found it's bi-directional. So what goes on in your head, so stressful thoughts, have some nerve links that goes onto your gut, which may or may not produce kind of symptoms of what you would call stress symptoms in your gut. And then the bi-directional means also what's going on in your gut, and a gut that's out of balance and not working well can also have an influence on your mood or your feelings and what's going on in your brain and the functioning of your brain. So that's the first thing they found, is this nerve connection, bi-directional. Then they've also understand even better what's going on with the microbiota in your gut. So those are all the bacteria, trillions of them, that are going on in your gut and what they're doing at any one time. And this one, I'll just go into this a little bit more because I find it fascinating. But I'll try not to be too nerdy about it. So we have, at any one time, we can often have up to 1.5, 2 kilos of gut bacteria in our gut, which are kind of like connected in with the kind of the fibre in your food and things like that. So they're not really quite sure what the weight is. But there's a lot going on in there. That's good and it's natural and you want them there. And why you want them there, the good ones, is they are doing all sorts of things in there. They are helping to facilitate your body to make neurotransmitters, and neurotransmitters are like these communicators in your body that can affect happiness, sort of, and feelings of joy and things like that in your brain. Those sorts of things, a communicator like that. Then also other things that these bacteria help make are key vitamins like vitamin B12, which can affect your mental health as well, and also how much energy you feel like you've got and things like that. And so these gut bacteria, and that's just a really simple description of what they're doing, and they're feeding off the food that's going on in there. So talk about feeding. If you're not putting the food into your gut that these good bacteria like, then you're not going to have much of this good bacteria. It's kind of that simple.
There you go. It's not dirty at all, although I bet you're all glad that we don't have a PowerPoint for this particular presentation.
Oh yeah,
if you have had breakfast or haven't had breakfast. I want to ask you about how to improve the health of your gut and the strength of that lining in a moment. But Sharon, could I go to you? I mean, we've talked about your work with Source Kitchen, but you mentioned blush breast cancer as well. So you do a lot of work with blush breast cancer, working with people who have been diagnosed with cancer, and then helping them sort out their lives, where to from here, from a mental health perspective. How much does diet come into the advice that you can offer people in that situation?
I think a lot, and sadly probably it's a cohort of, more ageing women, and we often run into that issue of obesity and overweight. So they're starting with all of those problems, but then we add in some chemotherapy and radiotherapy, and that changes biomes, changes bodies, changes everything. If they have an underlying mental health issue, it really comes to the fore. So, it's great to spend lots and lots of money on research for how we cure breast cancer, but that's not helping the women on the ground with it. So we are very strong advocates for general health and well-being in those women, because that's the only thing that they can do to change their outcome. So the studies have shown that ideal weight, exercise and mental health really impact on not getting the cancer back and not getting it again. So we have done a USQ. There's quite good studies going on out of USQ, and in fact some of the people at USQ are currently overseas doing studies. And we're looking at cortisol levels and things like that we get in response to instigating psychotherapy. We were using an ACT psychotherapy. So the ladies went to psychotherapy and another group went to exercise, and we looked at the impact. The scoring on mental health is very hard because, if you're depressed, you probably don't score well on mental health. Those people are always going to possibly overplay their mental health issues a bit. So it's very hard. But certainly that's our biggest message, is that the only thing that they can do to take control of the breast cancer is lifestyle.
But that covers, even though we're talking about diet today, that covers the whole gamut, doesn't it? As you say, exercise, physical activity, as well as what you put into your body.
And I think gone are the days, like we used to say, you have people come in and say, I can't lose weight, and we all go, well, refugees lose weight. But there's a lot of study now that's saying that it's not just what you put in and what you put out. Everybody's very differently wired. And so the genomics that will come eventually too will give us a great insight into why some people are overweight and why, despite the fact that they're exercising, eating all the right things, they still put on weight. And that's very hard to manipulate.
Very.
We still try to be overall balanced, in that, don't go and eat. I was saying to David, we've had 2 patients, they went on the carrot diet for their breast cancer and they turned orange. And it didn't make them any better. So we have to try to make everything, I think, easily and accessible,
Yeah.
which is, you know, Emma's running a cooking class after this to show you how you can put it into every day. But people are busy, and so the last thing that we think about is our diet often.
Oh, absolutely. And also, if you are a bit depressed and you're a bit tired, you think it's just overwhelming. It's such an effort to make a difference to your diet. Whereas people like Deakin University's Mood and Food Centre are showing that actually maybe just one little thing, like adding some sort of green leafy something, like to what you eat every day in any way, that in itself can make a profound difference, actually, when it comes to food. It doesn't have to be radical and this big overhaul of your diet necessarily. Yeah.
So there's lots of workers in the audience. You know, it must be impossible when you're on the ground, you know, where do you go for lunch?
Yeah.
What do you eat for lunch? It's much easier to pick up something in the fast food rather than something that's whole food from home.
Yes.
It requires energy and time.
And effort and a bit of thought and, yeah.
That's where it gets interesting, because I think there are, as I've been saying, there's so many different levels as to how you can approach adjusting your diet for mental health benefits. And there are people who are further down the track who just insist on not just cooking everything from scratch, which I would imagine is the starting point, but certain foods, and we've all heard of superfoods, and you know, even if you're cooking from scratch, it's not really worthwhile unless you're including 3 servings of kale and at least 3 purple carrots per day. If you're not, then your history, just go to McDonald's. You don't subscribe to that, obviously, but you've looked into this. You've written 2 books on it, the Happy Hormone Cookbook and the Bone Broth Bible. And we'll be talking more about bone broth, which is more about gut healing. But when people come to you for advice for starters, how do you recommend that they start down this journey? Keeping in mind baby steps, otherwise they probably just won't stick to it at all.
Well, that's exactly right. So if someone comes to my clinic, I find out what moment of change they're in, how much do they want to change? You know, what degree can they change? Or what's their mental health sort of state at the time, you know, or how tired are they? So it certainly could be really super baby steps. So it might be just, like I mentioned, not swapping even, but just trying to include in, say, some green leafy vegetables every day, or some broccoli or something green every day, just into what they're eating. If they're willing to go a little bit further and they're perhaps making, when they're home in the evening, perhaps they're actually being able to make something themselves, a very simple something, then I would suggest to them they use olive oil. And don't use any other fat at home, but use olive oil. And that will also be really helpful. That's based on the Mediterranean diet, and one of the key superfood, if we were going to use that term, ingredients to the Mediterranean diet, and one of the key things about why it's so profoundly good for your mental health as well as your whole body health is the extra virgin olive oil. So I might suggest they do that. And so the little thing, it's more about bringing stuff in necessarily than radically changing their diet. But if they're willing to go much further, then I would chat to them about what fiber's doing in their body and talk about feeding their gut bacteria and healing up their gut a bit if it's out of balance. And we'll go from there and just talk about whole foods and how to do that in a balanced way. But it might be just the green something each day, a bit of olive oil, perhaps a few nuts. That's great.
Do you find, and Sharon, I want to ask you in a moment, but do you find that pardon the pun, but it feeds on itself? So people will start with just those subtle changes. They'll realise that they start to feel good, and then the journey will sort of, you know, take on a bit of momentum of its own. Do you find that with people? In terms of they'll want to then sort of go further? Or, I don't know, I guess, you know, it's always that competition between how much time we have and, you know, the mind might be willing, but the body is tired.
I think we have to reinforce that everywhere along that pathway there's failures, and that's fine. You know, it's like any addiction, you know, trying to give up anything is not easy. And from our role is no judgment. So, you know, if they come back in and they put on 2 kilos, we go, okay, well, we didn't get it right, let's start again. I'm probably taking some of the pressure off, so I don't weigh people anymore. We tend to go more on body measurements and how they feel and whether they're sticking to the diet. So I had a lady that I sent away and she had a thyroid issue. So she was quite vigilant about going and searching everything up. There was an element of depression there. But she came back to me yesterday and she'd weighed when I saw her initially. And she said, look, I've been really good. I've been working so hard. And she got back on my scales and she'd lost 10 kilos. And she said, I'm still not going to weigh myself. I'm going to go away and do what I'm doing. So we have to, there is no right diet or wrong diet. There's no right approach to exercise, mental health. It's the one that fits the patient. So we can't, we can never dictate to our patients what we're going to do.
That's so true.
And everything's changing. What we thought was right last week is not right this week. So the latest exercise thing that's coming out is now that you'll probably be able to do 10 minutes post every meal, really high intensity, and that you'll get better benefits to outcomes with weight loss. So they're the latest studies that are coming out on exercise. Rather than going and doing an hour a day, you should be getting out and doing 10 minutes of really full on. But we have to take in all the comorbidities there. So in a diet, if you're coming into a menopausal woman, we also have to look at, calcium and vitamin D. So the lady that had lost the weight had no calcium in her diet. So, there are great tools where you go through the calcium scoring and you look at, so what else do we need to add in here?
This is it. This is exactly right. It's interesting about doing exercise post-eating. That's fantastic. That balances your blood glucose levels like you wouldn't believe it. It's so good for that. So that sort of spike, that spike you might get in like sugar going into your blood, by exercising straight after a meal each time, it's just 10 minutes, that just really balances that off. So that is a great weight loss tool, yeah.
Just to throw a spanner in the works, and it's interesting, Sharon, because you're obviously coming from the medical profession, but within GPs, there's such a wide spectrum of thoughts and attitudes about this sort of stuff that we're talking about. I mean, if someone's going to start radically changing their diet, is it better to get the advice of their GP? Or would some GPs say, look, it's all about exercise, doesn't matter what you eat, provided you exercise? Or some might say, look, there are more important things in life. Is there a wide variety of opinions within the medical fraternity about?
Well, government funding is now pushing lifestyle interventions.
Yep.
So that's where the money is in health. So, we now have what's called a GP care plan. So, like, GPs don't have enough time to do diet. It's just not, we can't support the patient enough. So a GP care plan is just a Medicare item which then allows patients to go and see an exercise physiologist, a dietitian,
That's right.
A physio, and so I link all of my patients into that. And you've got to suit the dietitian. Like, some dietitians are very much, well, you eat from the 5 food groups and it's what goes in and what goes out. But some that I've got have also got a very strong background in psychology. So they take on board that food is related to your emotions in both ways. So a lot of those people are very much more willing to work with patients. So I don't think GPs have got time to do it well. So I think you need to go to the right people, and it's finding those people in your community.
Absolutely. Emma, we talked about, there's so many different levels that people will want to get into this, and it tends to feed on itself. But can I go to, I mentioned the second book that you've written is called The Bone Broth Bible. And I'll never forget the night that my wife over dinner said, I think we're all going to start having a glass of bone broth each morning, Daddy and kids, and we all sort of, sounds like a great idea. And I must admit, I was pleasantly surprised, and my son, who had to be honest, even though I think being a teenager didn't want to admit that he liked this glass of what he called gruel at the time, absolutely loved it, and now it's the way that we start our day. But tell me about some of those things that people can get into that are not so much a meal in themselves, but can certainly enhance your feeling and that gut health, I suppose, as well.
So Okay, so the bone broth is about gut health. And if you can heal up the lining of your gut, then your body will absorb its nutrients better. You'll have less inflammatory response, actually throughout your body, if the gut's in a good state. And that then helps you with your well-being generally, with your mental health, with your energy, with weight loss and things like that. So coming back to bone broth itself, when you make bone broth, and bone broth is stock. You know, we used to call it stock, but the point with bone broth is you just cook it. You cook it on and on and on, which actually traditionally they used to do. They just have a pot on the stove, cooking away for over 24 hours. And we just, you know, in modern day life, we just sort of cook maybe some chicken bones for 2 hours and call that stock, and that's great. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like a 24-hour cooked bone mass. And that liquid you get, you pour off from cooking these bones, is very healing to the wall, the lining of your gut wall, and it has particular amino acids in it that the lining of your gut wall like, and so that helps to kind of heal up those cells. And funnily enough, the lining of your gut wall is actually very thin. There's not that many cells protecting you from kind of the nutrients you don't want in your food and what's going on kind of in your blood vessels, the other side of the wall. And also that thin lining also has to absorb in those nutrients and be active getting those nutrients in. And there's a lot going on there. And there's, you know, it's quite a big actual mass. You've probably heard about your gut being kind of, you know, many times longer than you imagine, and sort of all wound up in there. But the thing with the bone broth in there is it's just going straight to the gut and helping it to heal. And it is a matter of just drinking a little bit every day or incorporating it up. So like cooking with it, if you're cooking up, say, some brown rice or some chickpeas or something, you actually don't cook it in water, you cook it in a bit of bone broth, and then you've absorbed it in, so you don't have to drink it, you can eat it, and things like that. It's really good, really good. And so that goodness just then goes through your body because it's helped your gut work better. Yeah.
It's certainly not an unpleasant taste, and the aroma of having this stuff bubbling away in the crock pot or something for 24 hours
It's
is
interesting.
wonderful. Oh,
yeah,
it's
some
great.
people like it, some people hate it. My husband can't bear the smell in the house.
Really? Oh, I love it.
So actually it has to be
Yeah.
it has to be made outside, which is fine. It's in a big crock pot. But then I did solve it and get a pressure cooker, which actually makes the same goodness and the same thing in 2 hours. Anyway.
And no aroma.
And no aroma, that's
Win-win.
right.
Everyone's
yeah.
happy.
Yeah.
We're going to take questions from the floor in a moment, so have a think about any questions you'd like to ask. We can certainly do that, and we'll bring a microphone around. But I wanted to ask both of you, and perhaps Sharon, starting with you, tell me about some of the success stories that you've witnessed, you know, where someone has radically or even just marginally changed their diet but seen incredible results that were tangible that they've told you about. Do any come to mind?
So I think the lady that I had spoken about, that
Yeah.
it wasn't just the 10 kilos of weight loss, she felt so much better. We do, within the Fit Lab, we have a program that we fund women through exercise, and part of that is diet as well. And that's been, you know, if you read their testimonials, and we were in tears with one of them the other day because it's life-changing. You know, the whole lack of inflammatory markers body-wise, you know, if they can bend down and get to their children. We had another lady that was booked to go to China, she cancelled, and with diet and exercise, she felt much better, so she got to China. And it wasn't, you know, it wasn't tablets, it wasn't medication. But the big thing is, if we can, you know, do all the changes, is also seeing on those patients where you stop their antihypertensives, you stop their diabetic medication, because their whole health is so much better that they've got rid of those diseases. Yeah. So if we can say to people, well, you know, you need to do some work, you need to go back to the kitchen, you need to be eating well, it will just decrease the burden on the whole health system, and individuals will feel so much better for it.
No, Emma and I were both at the same function last night where a question was asked, I think by one of the mothers there, saying that she knew of a child who was in high school and was showing all the symptoms of depression and had actually been diagnosed with depression, But then I think what
And
they altered,
suicidal as
and
well.
suicidal, really at that dark, dark place that depression can take you. For some reason, they discovered, or through further testing, the mother wasn't willing to just accept that diagnosis for what it was. She wanted to find out a little bit more. And with food testing, it turns out that this young lad was a celiac. So once he got onto the right diet, transformative effects on his mental well-being, his mental health. And that's not saying there's no such thing as depression at all, but that's a classic example of how the right diet can make remarkable changes. Tell me about some of the other...
Yeah, so this is quite interesting because, for instance, I might have a woman that comes in, or a man, it's more, I see more women in clinic, a woman that would come in and she could be really quite down and depressed and a bit overweight, lacking in energy and that sort of thing. And we look at it, but I ask her, well, what's the most recent blood test results? I'd just like to see them. And sometimes it's fairly sort of standard markers that the GP's done. And they haven't dug deeper just to see what's going on with this woman. This woman might be 40 or 50 or 60. So I just say, look, do you mind going back to your GP and just asking for some further tests? Which is, for instance, just if she... I wouldn't necessarily test for celiac, perhaps, but I would ask her to test her thyroid, for instance. So if she was hypothyroid, that often expresses itself as putting on weight, being quite tired, and having feeling a bit depressed. And so if someone finds that they're hypothyroid and then they go on the really great easy medication that is hypothyroid, they might find that they actually naturally lose weight, have more energy, and in fact their depression goes. It's very unique to each person, but that's also where I just want to know that quite a bit of testing is being done. And this is actually really simple testing, a blood test that the GP can do. It's not a big deal at all. Yeah.
There are often things that you have to request, I suppose, or go in knowing what you want, because, you know, we're not attacking GPs,
Yes.
but as you said, Sharon,
no, we're not.
GPs
Yeah. Busy.
you know, trying to cram so much into that one consultation that this sort of stuff does tend to...
Usually in a screen for mental health, though, you will do thyroid function.
There we go, great.
Yep.
Often the psychiatrists are doing copper and
Yes.
magnesium. I think as two isolated factors they've been found to affect mental health as well.
Yeah.
It's a matter sometimes, it's just hard. Like the mental health issue usually is the last 2 minutes of your consult. So they'll come in and they'll have a cold and then they'll have an infected toe and then they'll go, oh, by the way, I feel a bit depressed. So, like notoriously, so when you arrive at your GP and they're running an hour late, it's usually because they've had that consultation. So that is when you have to sit there and go, okay. So it's not that we ignore it, it's not that we don't try to give it time. It just requires a lot of effort that we need to put in and that we have to put into every patient. And it's always, you know, the mental health, people just don't accept it as being, you know, it's part and parcel of our overall self. So if our mental health is not good, and, you know, and I probably end up with more of it because I always say to people, you know, is there anything that's stressing you? Are there any? And then I think, why did I ask that question? Because then everybody's in the waiting room going, my God, she's 2 hours late again. And everybody walks out of my room in tears. But
It's not good PR, is it,
no. But it's days like this, and, you know, thank heavens for Em that's organised it, where we just accept mental health is part of life. But we need to deal with it, and we need to deal with it in a very accepting way where, you know, we're all up and down, but we're all up and down to varying degrees. And if it's impacting on your life, there are things that we can do about it. And that's not going to the GP and saying, here, take some antidepressants, because that's my last port of call. If somebody's at risk, you probably go down that pathway a bit sooner. But that's the last bit. It's 9/10, you know, psychology, diets, exercise,
Yes.
finding interests, finding support. You know, mental health is just such a hard thing. And you can't get into a psychiatrist for love nor money because we're, you know, they're underfunded, they're overworked. But most people probably don't need a psychiatrist. They need, you know, they need an Emma to come home and make them bone broth and to support them. And you know, but we have to get, you know, they're depressed, they're not going to do anything. So you've got to it's baby steps always. And if you can constantly see them and say, well, you know, what have you instigated? Here's something I can help you instigate. It's very much a team approach, and they've got to form that relationship with somebody, be that the dietitian, be that the psychologist, be that the exercise physiologist, be that a cohort. And so that's been the great thing with our breast cancer ladies, is that they walk in and there's 12 other breast cancer ladies and they all get it. They don't have to talk about their chemotherapy, their radiotherapy, their change in image, their depression. They all get it because they're all on the same page. And when one of them gets a small gain, it's a party because all of them are there reinforcing each other. And so they've found that group to help them through. But it's very hard. I think particularly the teenage age group becomes more and more isolated in depression. And the schools do all they can. It's just a really hard area to try and, you know, monitor, control, treat.
If you've got any questions, we'll just raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone. I should add, when Sharon said what they really need is Emma to come around and make bone broth, that wasn't an invitation as such. She may be open to negotiations perhaps, but that wasn't a direct invitation. I didn't see that on your website as one of the services. If anyone's got a question, please raise your hand. This lady, is there a microphone we can aha, this young gentleman here, this lady in the blue. Thank you very much.
Hi. Totally enjoyed your talk this morning. I work in schools as a psychologist, and I just wonder if you ever envisage a day when there's a dietitian at a school preparing meals, because I see a lot of families that are pushed for time. Both mum and dad usually work, or the guardians or the caregivers, and the kids often open their lunch boxes and there's like packets of everything because there's food, but I think in their rush, you know, the rush and the stress that we all have trying to get to work on time every morning, we try and do the best we can. But, you know, like my parents used to talk of the old days where the milk came to school and it was off by the time they got it, because they lived in rural towns. But I just wonder if you ever envisage a day where at the ground level, where it's most important, where kids are learning, like we've got the best food available in Australia, but we've got packets in our lunchbox.
Eventually, off the back of research, that, you know, the government has to look at where they're rolling out their money. So if we're active, and, you know, the Dietetics Association, I think, you know, you'll get education evenings, you possibly... But, you know, tuck shops and all those things, like, they're trying. Like, I do think that they've removed a lot of the unhealthy food. They're trying to put in healthy food. Food en masse is harder. You know, like, we've done catering, and I suppose not high on your priority there is how many bits of green vegetable is in the catering. But, you know, there probably will need to be a way that bone broth can be packaged. And that's hard because you then lose all your active ingredients as soon as you start packaging anything. So it's a bit of a catch-22 where you can't put all that goodness into, here's a little popper of bone broth for your morning tea. You know, it's much easier to eat your, you know, Shapes biscuits and so forth. You know, I don't, you know, maybe lunch is just what lunch is at school. Like, none of mine were great. I would pack and you'd find 20 apples at the bottom of the bag at the end of term in various stages of decay. But, you know, if we can reinforce to parents that, like, breakfast is just so important for those children.
Oh, gosh, yes.
And, you know, and so it still comes back to education and choices, but lots of people want a very didactic plan. So I don't think we can go in and nebulously say, look, you should be eating from this and eating from this and eating from this. You need to almost put a plan in front of them. And that's where things like the CSIRO diet and those sort of things succeeded, because they had a plan and they had a grocery shopping list and they had a link to Coles and you could do it all. So we have to accept that we're not going back to the old days, and that we're living in a fast world, and that we somehow have to incorporate. And that's hence the, you know, the 10 minutes of exercise post every meal. You know, we're trying to put things into little minutiae where you can incorporate it into your daily life, and just keep going back and reinforcing to people the importance of that.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank
Can I
you.
just say, in the UK, they have a school meals. They provide, in all schools in the UK, in all state schools, they provide meals, lunch meals. But that's become, as Sharon hinted at, it's become an area, unfortunately, where, of course, they're trying to save a lot of money, so the school meals become more and more basic and less healthy, and become like that kind of that white Western diet kind of thing, with lacking in fibre and many vegetables that are much good. And so it's tricky, because I think schools providing lunches would be an awesome thing. That would be fantastic if it was nutritionally great and also something that kids would eat. But there's also the school ground, playground culture. I don't know whether whoever's mums or dads in the room, where you pack a lunchbox, and you might pack something that's super healthy, but the kids, they all open their lunchboxes around the playground, and they look at everybody else's, and this might be the super, I don't know, this gorgeous brown rice stir-fry thing that you cooked the night before, which is just full of gorgeous everythings, fibre, protein, and veggies, and the kid starts eating it, and they go, like they're looking at the kind of this package that and that package this, and there's a lot of pressure on parents. The kid comes back and says, well, could I have this packet of shapes or something in my lunchbox, please, and that's the thing. Or they might go to the supermarket with their parents shopping, and they'll go, oh, go on, can I buy this, just this for my lunchbox? And that pressure to actually eat rubbish food is enormous from the playground. So that's one thing that's pretty hard. The other thing is, I agree with the tuck shops anyway, or they are improving the food they offer to kids, and they're reducing down the amount of packaged food, and if it's packaged food, it's quite healthy. Like, you can buy little packaged dried chickpeas and dried fava beans or boiled beans now, which actually taste great for kids, and they're really super healthy. And you can have those sorts of things now, and they're in little packaged containers, so the kids can open it in their lunchbox in the playground and go, look at me, got my packaged food, but they're actually really healthy. So it's a minefield, actually.
It is.
It's hard. It's really hard for parents, because that pressure from the kids is enormous.
Absolutely.
For junk food. Yeah.
At my primary school, we used to have a swap meet on the netball courts at about 12:15 every day, because there's always a market for all sorts of food. You've just got to find the right customer. So heated negotiations would go on. I'd like to think it's different now.
Because, David, with your kids, that you often try and keep them away from certain foods, how does it work at school? Do they end up eating other people's foods? Or
I suppose we're in the fortunate position, and it's almost another story for another day, but we now homeschool our two boys so that we can police exactly what they eat. It's all part of my cunning master plan.
Another story, clearly.
But kids' parties are always a big thing, because traditionally that's the last bastion of as much junk food as you can pile into a child before you send them off to their parents and say, you deal with it. So that's always a difficult thing, because it's always that thing too of, you don't want to be, and our kids quite like eating healthy, but they've never met a hamburger that they didn't like. So there's always got to be exceptions, and how often do you make the exception? And does making one exception, then are you going to pay for it for a week afterwards? So it's always that balance between eating healthy but also acknowledging that they're kids and they like to eat junk food occasionally.
And taking away the guilt of junk food. I think we have to stop calling junk food.
Yes.
Like, my whole children's life, there was chocolate in their cupboard. And chocolate is not a treat. Chocolate's a part of their diet. We've still got their Easter eggs from last year, because it's not something that's special. It's just a little part of their diet. And we're never going to exclude all those things, but we can certainly take away some of, I think we need to take away that guilt. And, if they have a bad, if you have a bad eating day, you pick up the next day and go on.
Yep. Does anyone else have a question that you'd like to ask this lady down here?
Oh, it's not really a question, but it's just what you're saying. I thought it was really cool. My 5-year-old son came home from prep and he goes, and we don't eat a lot of junk or packaged food, but I said, this day he had a little chocolate treat and he said, that's a sometimes food. Hey, Mum. So it's not a bad food, it's just a sometimes food, but I haven't taught him that. He's learned all that at school. So
there you go.
That word, he's learned that phrase sometimes.
Yeah, and so he knows, like, you might have an apple every day.
That's a 5-year-old.
Yeah. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah. He's on a good path, I think.
Although sometimes food is a good phrase. I think that's okay, isn't it? Yeah.
Healthy food doesn't mean yuck. Like,
No.
I think
it's
No,
really
that's
hard
right.
to get, that really good food. We can make healthy treats and we can make.
Oh, absolutely.
It's just changing all that. So.
There's masses of great ones, yeah.
And I think through media, food blogs and all those sorts of things, and a lot of those are very whole food orientated. And, the photography and all that. So I think we are changing that culture somewhat. And the students that go off to university, they sometimes lose it for a little while. But I think if they've had that grassroots of mum and dad cooking at home for them, they come back to that eventually. And they, sometimes they go out of control for a while and you've just got to leave them to their own devices. But if they've had that grassroots of, well, yes, we do cook at home. And, and I know Mary Wagner and the schools were involved in Come to the Table program as well, where it needs to be a social event. Like we all still need to sit down at dinner and have time together. So, it needs to be a more family-orientated thing where, we're not sitting in front of television eating food. We need to make it all part of, of happiness and filling in what's happened in the day.
Can I just say one more thing and then I'll shush? But when you're talking about the school lunches, I do wish that it was like my mum's from England and she used to say how you'd go to school and the lunches would be made and everything. So why would it be that hard that, because often people, you've got to find money to get them tuck shop. So forget this traditional tuck shop. What if it was going back, like to the way they do it in the UK, that you had lunches, so whether, I don't know how it goes into the school fees or the whatever, or the government or whatever, however it gets paid for, but it's already all paid for somehow for the year, and it's just part of, it'd be so good if it was just part of it and that it was healthy, like it was,
Sorry.
No, you're
It
right.
would be great on so
Absolutely.
many levels, because there wouldn't be any choice, which I think is a good thing. You sit down and you have a meal. I mean, obviously, dietary requirements would be taken into consideration. And the children have to sit down to eat, so that's like a social thing equivalent of trying to sit down in the evening as a family. Things like that. It's just fantastic, but my gosh. The infrastructure to put that in place and the
I know.
government... Sorry,
The
David, I
expense.
jumped straight in.
No,
but,
not at all,
golly.
no.
I know it's
I think
easier
that's
said than done, but I just wish it was a bit easier.
Yeah, in an ideal world, I just think
It'd be
anytime
fabulous.
you corporatise something or governmentise, is that a word, something, there'll always eventually be that pressure to bring the price down and to do it cheaper. And, there'll be costs cutting somewhere. I know this because I work at the ABC. So really the emphasis, sorry, don't tell anyone I said that. The emphasis has got to come back to parents, I suppose, as to whether they're willing to spend that money or to spend that time, because it's hard to have a corporate approach to that,
Or
isn't
maybe
it?
there's an option to pay at the beginning of the year, I don't know.
Perhaps, yeah.
I'd
perhaps.
do it. I'd love it.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll leave it.
There's a question here.
Sorry. My son is autistic, and so he's just been put on a diet where it is junk food. And after listening to this, I'm a little bit worried about it because he's so underweight. So they're trying to make him gain weight. So he was on pretty much a healthy diet for ages, and there was no change in behaviour or anything like that. But now I'm worried to see if maybe this might have an impact on his mental health when he's a bit older, or now, or he will open his lunchbox and it is all packed and it is junk food.
I suppose it's difficult for me or us to comment on somebody else's management of your son. It sort of is counterintuitive to me, and
seem to
probably
be.
today.
And he's been checked for celiac
Yes,
disease?
yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So his GP was really against it, but his specialist has overruled him to get him to gain weight. So
And this
now
is
I'm worried.
specific to get him to gain weight?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, well...
Some of the issue becomes some of the medication for autism and so forth makes students lose weight, and hence that's why they're only on it in school term,
Yes.
and they come off it in holidays so that they can pick up the weight gain
weight,
there.
yes.
I would have thought probably a better way to gain weight was really look at the carbohydrates, the quality carbohydrates that you're getting, and your protein. So I wouldn't necessarily, you have a choice as a mother and he's your child,
Yeah.
and if you feel unhappy with that, well then, you make a
Yes.
decision.
He would prefer watermelon, healthy food, because we grow our
See,
own
that's-
food. So he would prefer to eat healthy.
And I think you have to do, as parents, we have a feeling what is right for our children. So if that's what you feel, I think, you know, it's going to require a lot of energy on your behalf, but you probably need to look within the healthy food range and the whole food range of what there will negate the weight losing effect of, I'm assuming probably medication is possibly the issue there. But he certainly can get that weight gain through a lot better sources. But
nuts and seeds at school, obviously, nuts at home. If you've got time, making something which is dense with seeds for him to take to school, kind of things like that. That's nuts at home. Sorry.
Seeing a dietitian, you know, may be worthwhile.
Absolutely.
You know, because and just getting that holistic picture of, yes, he's got an issue, and there's the issue of his mental health and his autism, there's the issue of his weight, and there's also the issue of his diet. So it all needs to be brought together.
It seems to me that you're in this fantastic situation where your son likes to eat healthy foods. You know, because as you know, with some kids on the spectrum, they'll be very rigid in what they will and won't eat. And if you're lucky enough that what they will eat or what they like is healthy food, well, you're on a winner. If it's the other way, then it's like turning back the tide.
But Macca's and it will just still be left in the box.
Yeah, see, that's extraordinary. And I mean, you will, and I can say this based on my own experience, but also from reading, that if you switched his diet to something that still helped him gain the weight, but was whole foods or made from scratch on the advice of a dietitian, you would notice a marked difference in his behaviour. There is absolutely no doubt. And you know, probably already know that, but the difference would be remarkable after that detox period. It would be extraordinary.
Has there been any studies done from children eating junk food as children and then becoming adults and having mental health issues?
So that's the whole, the whole question about biomes, and if you talk to the endocrinologist, and that's where all the study goes. It's not, you know, and you need certain things to develop your brain, you know, and that's why exclusion diets are really difficult, because you're not getting the whole picture. So lots and lots of studies to come.
Somebody at the back.
We've got 5 minutes, but actually, I know this lady down here has had her hand up for a long time, so we should have time. We'll just get your question. You've been very patient. Thank you very much.
Hi, Khalees. My name's Khalees. I work in community services and disability, and often the other ugly head of depression I see is anxiety. Is there any food groups that you can recommend to manage anxiety?
Okay. Yeah.
I don't think specifically we tend to just say a food group. I think we tend to once again go back to an overall picture of, you know, the Mediterranean diet and so forth.
Totally.
And sometimes it's educating the carers, isn't it? Because the carers are the ones that are, and I know that at Source we're now doing quite a number because of the NDIS and people being able to spend their money in different ways. And particularly some of the people with anxiety, depression actually do like to cook, and they've got an interest in food. But we're actually doing classes to carers where the carers are coming in and they're learning the value of nutrition, and, you know, we could install Emma there weekly and do a class. And so the flow on then, it still becomes anxiety. Anxiety links over to depression, and so, you know, the panic attacks, it depends upon, you know, if the anxiety is food-based or whether it's an anxiety about other things. But you'll go back and they'll be doing the comfort eating, and, you know, they'll have panic attacks, and sometimes they stay at home and they don't go out. So it's a whole big scenario, but I don't think, and I would certainly stand corrected, but, you know, we try not to focus on one specific thing all the time. We try to look at the whole picture, but how you can instigate other things like, you know, nuts and healthy foods, and just trying to change diet.
Yeah, I also would look at how much sugar they're eating. There's nothing wrong with some sugar, you know, a little bit of sugar, but if there's a lot of sugar in what they're eating, I'd actually try and swap that for something else, try and bring that down, because sugar does put your body into a little mini anxiety state every time you eat it. So that might help as well.
It goes back to that comfort food, like what they've got.
Right. So that's why. Some. You know, I'm not saying no sugar at all, but just about the amount, and simple carbohydrates like white flour products, which also kind of put that body into.
We may have time for just one more question if we're really quick, and I think there was a lady up the the back there. We'll just have to come and grab this microphone. And we'll make this a final question, but I think, Emma, you're doing a cooking class over at Source directly after what
Pretty
time
well
is it?
directly after. Pretty
All
well.
right.
That's a good answer, isn't
There
it?
you go.
But I'll have to go off
You're right.
fairly soon after.
Because I was just going to say, if you have more questions, you can ask both Emma and Sharon afterwards, time permitting. But then also you take emails via your website, both of you.
Yes,
I would imagine.
absolutely.
Yeah, yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
Yeah.
Just
yes.
a final question, the lady up the back.
I just have a question about, like, aside from seeing a dietitian and that kind of thing, resources to develop like a balanced view of food. Because I know that for me growing up, if I ate, it was a cheese stick. You know, that was about it. And then by the time I hit late primary school, middle school, I was just pumped full of junk food. And now as an adult living on my own, I don't cook meals. I don't know what to do because it's all overwhelming. I've always had one thing or another, and I don't know where to go for a balanced view of what's okay and what's not. Like,
I think still going back to, nutritionists and some of the, it's probably worthwhile going to Emma's website. And that's the age group that we're finding is difficult because particularly if you live by yourself, you stock the whole fridge and it's all gone off by the end of the week. So it becomes a costly. I find a lot of people in your situation are using some of the delivered foods. And I don't have an issue with them because I think they're probably better. Some of the, and I'm sorry I can't think of the names of them, but I know some of the young professionals and young working people, because they're so frantic, they can do the breakfast cereal, they can do an egg and toast in the morning, but lunch and dinner's all too hard. So they're getting the food delivered, and that's actually, it seems formidable, but it's actually cheaper than going out and buying a whole grocery full of fridge work. There is one excellent website if you want to look at specific things, and so there's been the talk about turmeric and we've gone through lots of different things, and some of those things are very good. So if you want to look at a specific herb or natural thing, there's a website, if you Google Sloan, as in Sloan Kettering University, and you put in Sloan Kettering herbs, that will bring up all the latest, because we're going back to green tea for prostate, we're going to ginger for overall health.
Gut health.
And gut health and cider vinegar. And it will actually give you in layman's terms, so the Sloan Kettering is an enormous university, but they've put all of those, you can just put in ginger and it will bring you up the research and tell you whether it will or won't help your diet. I still think if you can get a sensible dietitian, you can get a fairly sensible... We from Source did some cooking classes for people leaving university about, how you cook mince one day and then you incorporate that into tacos the next day, because it's really difficult, I think, in your age group, living by yourself, trying to cook, so I know where you're coming from.
Yeah. And I always have that philosophy, cook once, eat twice, or even cook once, eat 4 times, but cook once, eat twice, where you might bother making an evening meal, but make a lot of it and then eat it for the next few days. If it's a good, wholesome evening meal, then there's no problem with eating it over several days.
In fact, sometimes it tastes better on the second and third day. It ferments and all the flavours. It's fantastic. We'll have to leave it there. I know that we could talk about this for a long time, and we all certainly could. It's something that the two of you are passionate about, but time has beaten us. Thank you very much for coming along, and I'd like to thank Sharon and Emma. Thank you very much.
Thanks.